Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. When Ethan sat down to eat supper that Thursday night, I felt a sense of happiness and contentment. Why wouldn't I? I just spent 3 hours with my black lover, Marcus Johnson, and was still basking in the afterglow. I was wearing his old football jersey, a ritual I followed after every rendezvous. Before he even touched his stew, Ethan dropped a bombshell. He knew. How? I had been so careful. For 2 years, I had kept my affair a secret. I had only confided in my best friend, Laura, 2 weeks ago. But now my husband knew. I had to think fast. I never denied Ethan sex after being with Marcus, but I made sure to avoid intimacy for a couple of days. That was my strategy. I needed him to understand that what I had with Marcus was just different. There was no love involved. I loved Ethan, he was my soulmate. That was something I needed to make clear. But with Marcus, it was all about wild, unimaginable pleasure. It had become an addiction, and I wasn't ready to give it up. Laura had warned me this day would come, but I had dismissed it. Now I had to face the truth, or at least part of it. I lied to Ethan, telling him I only saw Marcus every 2 or 3 months. That wasn't true. I saw him at least every other week, sometimes every week. I could easily escape for a few hours because Ethan was always working, and I was a housewife. If Ethan ever asked where I'd been during the day, I covered it with shopping trips, errands, or lunch with Laura. He always believed me, but now the time had come to admit what I'd been doing. Besides lying about the frequency of my encounters with Marcus, I implied that Marcus was the only one. I didn't tell Ethan about the times Marcus shared me with his partner during West Coast runs. Thank God Marcus was on a short run today. Explaining those incidents would have been difficult. I also told Ethan that he was the only one who had shared such an intimate experience with me. That was only half true. I never let Marcus do it due to his size. But there was one time when I allowed Marcus's 16-year-old cousin to. He had been on a ride-along with Marcus that trip. The kid wasn't as big, so I decided to experiment. As for Marcus's partner, he and I had engaged in split roast, a form of double penetration. I never told Ethan about these other encounters. After hearing my confession, Ethan said he was going to see a lawyer and file for divorce. I tried to convince him otherwise, explaining the consequences of such a decision, hoping to change his mind. He left the table without touching his stew and slept in one of the extra bedrooms. I cleaned up the kitchen and called Laura, hoping for some comfort. She tried to calm me down, suggesting that Ethan might eventually get over the shock and reconsider his decision. But I wasn't sure. I cried myself to sleep that night. The next day, I could hardly get out of bed. Friday came and Ethan returned home from work. He brought me flowers and apologized. He said he didn't want to lose me. He even told me I could continue seeing Marcus if that was what I needed to stay in our marriage. I warmed up the stew and we ate. Later, he took me to bed, where we grew closer in a way that deepened our connection. Saturday morning, I told Ethan I needed to buy groceries and would stop by Laura's to share the good news. I waved goodbye as I backed out of the garage, never realizing that would be the last time I'd see him. The afternoon was spent at Laura's, where I told her everything. Finally, the complete truth. Laura had advised me to apologize to Ethan the previous night, but I hadn't felt the need. I wasn't sorry, I loved being with Marcus. She had also suggested I promise never to see him again. I nearly laughed. That wasn't happening. When I wanted to get pregnant, I'd stop until I was sure the child was Ethan's. I wondered what it would feel like to fuck Marcus with a swollen belly. I told Laura that Ethan and I had worked things out. He had accepted my affair as long as I kept it discreet. I acted as though everything was fine, like I had everything under control. But Laura had warned me to be careful. She knew Ethan well, and she didn't think he was the forgiving type. I laughed it off. Ethan loves me. He tells me I'm special, that no one compares to me, I said. Those words would come back to haunt me. When I returned home, Ethan wasn't there. It wasn't unusual. He often worked late. I tried calling his phone at 6 p.m., but it went straight to voicemail. I called again and again until 9 p.m., then decided to call his boss to find out where he was. The man on the other end of the line wasn't friendly. He told me Ethan had quit his job the day before and that he had no idea where Ethan was. Then he hung up. Panicked. Ethan loved his job, why would he quit? I called Laura, but she didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. I cried. I yelled at Ethan in my mind, then begged God to bring him back. I walked around the house in circles until I finally collapsed in bed, crying myself to sleep. The next morning, Laura came over and made me breakfast. I didn't want to eat, but she insisted. "Maybe I should report him as missing," I said. "Bad idea," Laura replied. "Once you tell the cops about your affair, they'll laugh you out of the station." "That's just it," I said. "We didn't fight. We made love the night before he left. That's what worries me." Ethan had a plan. "Tomorrow morning I'll call in sick, and we'll go to the bank. We need to check your accounts." "I'm not worried about that. Ethan still loves me. He'll be back. He loves this house and—" "Sue, you lied to the man for 2 years and cheated on him with a black man before you were even married. Believe me, you need to go to the bank." The next morning, Laura picked me up and we headed to the bank. The $500,000 CD? Gone. I asked how that was possible without my signature. They explained it was in his name only. I had assumed it was in both our names. Then came the next shock. The house. There was a mortgage on it for $150,000. I asked the banker how I was supposed to pay that since I didn't work. He just shrugged, telling me it was no longer his problem, and if I didn't make payments, I'd lose the house. I cried all the way home. The reality finally hit me. Ethan had taken all our money, leaving me with a mortgage I couldn't pay. I was a wreck. The following Wednesday, Marcus called, and I went to the motel to meet him. I didn't dress up that day. I wore jeans, a sweatshirt, and just a bra. When he saw me like that, he asked, "What's wrong?" I told him everything. How Ethan had left me with nothing. How he had taken everything and disappeared. Marcus laughed. "Your husband finally found out who you are and left you. That's different. Some men would put up with it because they think they can't get anyone else or they're too pathetic to care. Ethan didn't. He found out you're not that special. I respect him for leaving you. I would have done the same." Hearing that made my blood boil. Marcus was the cause of all this. If he had just left me alone, I would still be with Ethan. It was all his fault. I stormed out, telling him to never call me again. As I drove past the Waffle House, a thought crossed my mind. Ethan had said he saw me with Marcus, but what if he lied? What if Laura had told him everything? I turned around, parked, and walked inside. A waitress with tattoos on both arms came over to take my order. I only wanted a cup of coffee. When she returned with it, I showed her a picture of Ethan. "Do you remember him?" I asked. "Of course. Big tipper. He sat right there last week, looked out the window the whole time. When I brought his food, he didn't even touch it. I asked him what was wrong. He said he wished he'd seen a ghost. Then he left a tip, and walked out. You his wife?" "Yes. I bet he saw you going into that motel room with that truck driver. Marcus brags about you to anyone who'll listen. Tells everyone he's about to screw some married woman." I ran out of the Waffle House, furious. How dare Marcus tell everyone about our affair? It was supposed to be our secret, and he was blabbing about it to anyone who would listen. Back at home, I threw Marcus's old football jersey in the trash. I wanted to repaint my bedroom, but I didn't have money for that. For months later, I had to move out of the house. My parents helped me find a cheap apartment and I got a job at a big box store. I never heard from Marcus again, and I wasn't surprised. Laura said she thought he probably had other women while he was on his runs, while at home, he was probably a faithful husband and father. I didn't care. I was just trying to survive. As the months dragged on, I fell deeper into depression. I couldn't shake the hope that Ethan might return, but after 6 months, I finally let go of that dream. He was never coming back. I wasn't his soulmate anymore. I wasn't special, and once I accepted that, the depression only grew worse. One night, I came home from my minimum wage job, tired and defeated. I went to the medicine cabinet to grab my antidepressants. As I stared at the bottle, I realized I had replaced one addiction with another. My eyes shifted to the pack of razors I had bought when I moved in. I couldn't look away from them. That night, I didn't hear from Sue. It wasn't unusual lately. She was working long hours. The next day, I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I called the store where she worked, and they told me she hadn't shown up for the last 2 days and hadn't called in. Panic set in. I left work early and drove to her apartment. Her car was parked outside. I knocked on the door, then banged on it, screaming her name. When there was no answer, I called the police and asked for a welfare check. I found the apartment manager, and we waited for the police to arrive. When they entered, one of the officers came back to the door, his face pale. He spoke into his radio. "What's that?" the manager asked. "Suicide," the officer said softly. I collapsed into tears. I had to identify her. Sue, my best friend. She had taken her own life. The funeral was a blur. People talked about how happy Sue had seemed with Ethan, blaming him for leaving her. They thought he had run off with someone else. They didn't know the truth, and I wasn't about to correct them. There was no point. Sue wasn't the saint they thought she was, and Ethan wasn't the devil they painted him to be. After hours of listening to people speculate, I stepped outside for some air. As I stood on the porch, watching kids play basketball across the street, a taxi pulled up. A tall man got out and paid the driver. A basketball bounced his way, and he caught it effortlessly with one hand. Big hands, I thought. One of the kids yelled for him to take a shot. Instead of shooting, he dribbled the ball towards the basket, put a move on one kid in his way, jumped, and dunked the ball to cheers from the group. After high-fiving the boys, he walked over to the funeral home. As he approached where I was standing, I said, "You just proved the saying wrong. White men can jump. Well, being 6 feet 5 inches tall helps when I want to dunk a basketball. Is this where the services for Sarah Turner will be held?" "Yes." "Is Ethan inside?" "I would like to." "Ethan disappeared almost a year ago." "Disappeared? What happened? You look familiar. Where have I seen you before?" "I was one of the groomsmen at their wedding." "You were the maid of honor, right?" "Yes, I was." "I'm surprised you remember me." Hard to forget a tall, beautiful redhead. I felt myself blush as I thanked him for the compliment. "I remember you too. You were by yourself. All the other groomsmen had their wives with them, and you wore your army uniform. You didn't stay for the reception. You do remember me." I'm impressed. But I did go to the reception. I stayed maybe a half hour, then had to catch a flight back to Bragg, where I was stationed. My wife didn't come with me. She had other things to do. "Are you still in the army?" I asked, snubbing out my cigarette. "No, I got out about 6 months later, supposedly to save my marriage. I found out 3 months after getting out. It wasn't the army she didn't like. It was me." He laughed when he said that. "So, you're divorced now?" "Widower." The divorce wasn't final when she ran her car off the road and hit a tree. I didn't have to pay the ridiculous amount of alimony the court had ordered, so it worked out for me. What's this about Ethan disappearing? I looked towards the door and thought better of taking him inside to hear all the lies and speculation. "Let's walk down to the coffee shop on the corner, and I'll tell you the truth about what happened. My name is Laura Sullivan. I was Sue's best friend since grade school. I'm Angus O'Shea. I only met her once at the wedding. Ethan and I served 2 tours in the sandbox together. You want to go in and view the body before we leave? I saw enough dead bodies in Iraq to last me a lifetime." He took my hand as we walked down the street. Over coffee, I told him the entire true story of Sue, Ethan, and Marcus. "So you knew she was cheating on Ethan?" "For about 2 weeks before he disappeared. I wanted her to break it off with Marcus, but she wouldn't listen. I warned her what would happen if he found out. Maybe that was a mistake. It seemed to embolden her. That girl was really messed up. She even invited me to go with her and be a part of a threesome with her and Marcus. Like I would ever do that. So, you're not into kinky sex?" I decided now wasn't the time to tell him about my past, especially not the spring break trip I took during my senior year in college. I drank too much and ended up dancing naked around a bonfire on the beach. That's all I remembered until I woke up the next morning in a room full of frat boys from some college up north. I could barely walk the rest of the trip. After graduating, my first job was working for one of the partners at a law firm. She was an older lady and a lesbian. 6 months later, on an overnight trip to help a client, I woke up in bed next to her after a night of celebrating the signing of a big contract. That relationship soured soon after we returned home. She became very possessive, and I decided I wasn't into girls. I quit and found another job. I've done my share of kinky stuff, but I have my rules. One being, I don't fool around with married men. That never turns out well for either party. Being single and working in a law office, I get hit on a lot by married men. I've been offered trips to Las Vegas, the Bahamas, and even one to London. An afternoon in a cheap motel with a married truck driver is not on my bucket list. Good to know. We better get back. The service starts at 2 p.m. Are you staying for the service? I planned on it. What time do you have to leave for? I know nothing about you. I'm sorry. All we've talked about is Sue and I. How about we go to the service? Then meet up later for supper. I'll get a hotel room and spend the night, then leave tomorrow. That sounded like a great idea. I wanted to get to know Angus better. Much better. At 29, I was tired of living alone. I wanted to get married and start a family before it was too late. I was looking for someone who met my standards for a husband. So far, he had passed 2 requirements. First, he was not married, and secondly, he was tall. I'm 5 feet 10 inches and refuse to date a man shorter than me when I'm wearing high heels. I wanted to see if he passed my other requirements. One is that he has a good job and works hard. I make a nice salary, and I won't support any loafers. The other is that he must be faithful. I will not live with a cheater. The last requirement is, well, we'll talk about that later. Somewhat negotiable, maybe. The service was uneventful. The minister never mentioned suicide but talked about mental illness. Angus and I left as soon as it was over. Sue was on her way to be cremated. I called an Uber for Angus to take him to his hotel, and I went back to my apartment to get ready for my date. In my bedroom, I stripped off the dark blue pantsuit I had worn to the funeral, my usual business attire, along with my practical 2-inch heels. I selected a black, strapless mini dress that stopped 6 inches above my knees, smoky black thigh-high stockings, and my 5-inch black stiletto heels. I soaked in a hot tub using a razor to touch up my narrow red landing strip. The carpet matches the drapes. After getting out of the tub, I brushed out my long red hair, used my most expensive perfume, then dressed. I checked myself in the mirror and declared myself ready. I drove over to the steakhouse he had recommended. He met me at the entrance, kissed me on the cheek, and we walked in. Since we didn't have a reservation, we had to wait in the bar for a table. There, he passed another of my requirements. As we entered the steakhouse, 4 young women sitting at a table caught my attention. They were dressed in miniskirts and high heels, their bare legs on full display. The moment we walked in, their conversation halted, and all eyes shifted to Angus. Dressed in the same suit from the funeral, complemented by black alligator cowboy boots and a black cowboy hat, Angus appeared even taller. Despite the attention, his focus remained entirely on me, making me feel like the only person in the room. After a brief wait, we were called to our table. We ordered New York strip steaks with baked sweet potatoes, and as we waited for our meals, Angus began sharing more about himself. I chose this place because it's one of our customers, he explained. Curious, I asked, what do you do for a living? I work in sales for my family's business. After leaving the army, I needed a change from blowing things up. A cousin runs the business and she offered me a job. Turns out I'm pretty good at sales, he said with a chuckle. Wait, I said, my eyes widening. Angus O'Shea? O'Shea beef. 100% Angus beef? Melt in your mouth tender? You're part of that family? That's right, he replied, grinning. And yes, my name is Angus. My parents have a strange sense of humor. Trying not to laugh, I added, well, that explains it. Our steaks arrived and they were delicious. We shared an apple pie for dessert, and it became clear the waitstaff was eager for us to vacate the table. At the door, I offered to take him back to his hotel. He accepted, and I drove him to the Hyatt. As we arrived, he suggested, How about a nightcap? I agreed, and we entered the bar. Angus ordered a bourbon, neat, and I asked for the same. As we sipped our drinks, I felt nervous. I looked into his eyes and spoke up. Angus, I'm not a virgin, but I'm not a slut either. I never, on the first date, but I struggled to finish my sentence. He understood and reassured me. I get it. Don't worry. Before he could say more, I leaned in and kissed him. The kiss deepened, our passion growing as we stood up, our hands exploring each other. His cowboy hat fell off, but he didn't stop kissing me. His hands caressed my back and then slid lower, squeezing my ass. The bartender interrupted. You guys need a room. I have a room, Angus replied, and I didn't hesitate. We headed upstairs, where a heated exchange of kisses turned into a race to undress each other. When I pulled down his boxers, I knew my last requirement for a husband had been more than met. Angus exceeded it. The following morning, as we lay in bed, waiting for room service, I asked, "What time is your flight?" I flew in on the company plane. The pilots had to leave for another flight today, but I told them I'd find my own way home. What about you? I took the rest of the week off. I thought I'd need the time to grieve Sue's death. We'll work on that, he said with a smile. By Sunday morning, I found myself in Angus's bed again, having not been home for 5 days. We hadn't left the hotel room since checking in. We shared stories about our lives, including my short-lived lesbian affair and dancing naked around a bonfire during spring break. He told me about his time in Iraq, how Ethan had saved his life, and the tragic story of his first wife. That afternoon, I took him to the airport, and as I waited for his call to confirm he had arrived safely, I felt an excitement I hadn't experienced in a while. When he finally called, we spoke for over an hour, both confessing how much we missed each other. We ended the conversation with, "I love you." Monday came and neither of us called. We were both busy catching up on work, but by Tuesday morning, the receptionist buzzed me. "There's a big cowboy in the lobby asking for you," she said. "Hurry. He's about to steal my heart." I laughed, knowing exactly who it was. Rushing to the lobby, I found Angus wearing a dark brown leather jacket, white western shirt, jeans, and brown cowboy boots. I ran into his arms, and we kissed passionately. Then, in front of me, he dropped to one knee, pulling out a ring box. "Will you marry me?" he asked. Tears filled my eyes as I screamed, "Yes," over and over. He kissed me to silence my joy. We planned to live happily ever after, and for some reason, I haven't smoked a cigarette since the funeral home. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.